Hi, my name is Ralph Nyberg. Welcome to Adobe Connect for Instructors version 2. The objective of this tutorial is just to kind of give instructors an idea about going through basically a checklist of things to get done when you first start your class before your students arrive, and then also maybe some other tips about using Connect in the classroom. So I have a session here that I've launched into, and this is what Adobe Connect looks like first thing in the morning when we launch our session. So just to kind of go over the things that we want to get set up before our students arrive. The first thing on your meetings tab here, we may want to look at, and again this part's sort of optional, but we may want to look at inside of our preferences manipulating our cursor. This certainly isn't something that you have to do, but under meetings and preferences there's a couple different places where we have options for our cursor. You'll see here that there's a host cursor option here, and deciding whether or not we want to display that information to only other hosts, which really wouldn't be anybody because our students aren't hosts, show to all attendees, or show to attendees when using the whiteboards. And that can be a useful thing so that students can track along. You know, sometimes we'll sit there with our mouse pointer and point to things and not realizing that our students don't actually see the mouse pointer. So that's where we set up the host cursor. Now we also have on the screen share, when we're sharing our screen, there's this option to check the box to show the application cursor. So instead of getting the default cursor for Adobe Connect, we want to see the actual cursor in the application, which obviously is very beneficial if you're teaching something like Excel, you know, where the cursors change depending on what you're doing. So we can go ahead and check that particular box. Okay, again, that's modifying your cursor properties are not necessarily essential, but that may provide some extra value for your students. The next thing you want to do, especially if you're on a new computer, is you always want to make sure that you go through and verify that your audio is correct. So you're going to want to walk through the audio setup wizard. And so, especially on a new computer, first day of class, things like that, good idea to walk through the audio setup wizard just to make sure your audio is set up correctly. So again, you can test your sound output. Whoa, that's working. And then you can come select which microphone you want to use. You know, for most of our New Horizons centers, we use this USB audio codec for our microphone. Go ahead and record our white noise. To show the microphone is working, click record, read the following statement. So we say, I can see the recording bar is moving, my microphone is working properly. Okay, then we can play that back if we so choose. Then on next, we test our silence. Okay, so you've got ambient noise, HVAC, something like that in your environment. You're going to want to go through this silence test. So let me be as quiet as possible here. Man, it's hard for me to be quiet. All right, so now click on next here, and then go ahead and finish. Now the next thing I'm going to do, just so I don't forget, okay, again this can happen really at any point in time, but I'm going to enable my microphone rights for my participants. You know, this has got to be done on a daily basis for like a multi-day class. So come up here to audio and say microphone rights for participants, just to make sure that once our students start joining the class that they can in fact talk to us. Next thing I want to do is I want to modify my hands up pod. So the hands up pod has the ability to make some relatively obnoxious sounds. And so, you know, I want to make sure that I nip that in the bud. And so I need to come over here and I need to, whoops, let's make that a circle. I need to modify the settings. Okay? So I go ahead and click on my settings, and then there's a couple different things that I'm going to do. I'm going to enable stepped away, okay, and I'm going to turn off the sound for all sounds except raise hands. Now the chat sound option, and certain instructors differ in whether or not they want this on or off. This makes a sound every time someone enters in a new chat. I typically leave chat sound on because I sometimes will forget to look in the chat window, but that's an instructor preference option there on whether or not you want that chat sound. Depending on how much chat's going on in your class, it may be distracting to have that much noise, so that's really an instructor preference issue there. And then I go ahead and close. Got everything muted. Okay. Now remember, you're going to want to mute it here in the settings, because if you just mute it here, you do have the option. There's a little speaker here where I can, mute my sounds there. But if I do that, then it's just muted for me, and my students are still going to hear the sounds whenever anybody claps their hands, or the laugh track and things like that. So make sure that you mute it for everyone by going into the settings options. Okay, and from here I start to configure my layouts. All right, now my basic philosophy on this is I have, I use the lobby layout is what I would call my pre-class layout. Okay, and so this is how I want things set up before class starts. So definitely I need a chat window before class starts. Welcome to online. Now I like to have my students, appear over here on the right. Again, this is these are preference issues. I don't typically use notes, okay, per se. So the notes does not necessarily have a lot of value to me, so I go ahead and hide that. You may use notes, that's perfectly fine. I'll go ahead and add in my files pod. I'm going to take my hands up and I'm going to go ahead and move that down. And then from here, I'm going to go ahead and put my timer on there. And I just use the stock timer that Connect gives us. Most of us know there are some issues with that. And then I also will add in some additional information. Specifically, I'm going to bring my webcam in. A lot of people won't have their webcam as part of the pre-class layout. I have a couple different webcams. One of them is on me, one of them is on my fish tank. So I like to I let my students watch the fish in the morning before they show up. So I bring up this. Now, all right, so this is my pre-class layout, okay, or some variation of my pre-class layout. And then I go to my lecture. I get that dialed in the way I like it. Okay. And what I've found, this is something that Rob Folkrod showed me, is moving the hands up to the. Let me move that guy up here, over here, next to my chat. So we'll park that right there. And this is about, how I have my layout, okay, for teaching classes. What I like to do at that point in time is I go ahead and make a bunch of copies of that. Okay, so I just to make copies, you come down here and you click on plus button right there. This button over here can put you in presentation mode. If you go into presentation mode, then the students don't see you manipulating the view. I really don't mind if my students watch me. They figure, I'm showing them that I'm doing work, and I don't mind, so I don't typically put it in a presentation. But once I have my lecture the way I like it, then I'm going to go ahead and click on my plus button here. I'm going to create a duplicate, and then now normally what I do is I do it for each of my topics for the day. Let's say, for example, we're going to start out the day, with VLANs. Okay. And then you drag that up, all right? And then I go ahead and make another copy. Again, I'm going to make a duplicate. So make sure when you're doing this that you're selecting this option to duplicate. Okay. And then you go ahead and give it a name. Okay. So after VLANs, we're going to do static routes. And I'm just sort of making up topics here. Go ahead and click on OK. Now I got another new view. Drag that up. And ultimately, I'll have like 8 copies by the end of the this process, because what this does, and the reason I do this, is because when the class is recorded, as I switch to my different layouts, it makes a nice index in the recordings for each particular subject. Now the other thing that I do is that I create a layout for my labs, my lunches, and my breaks. And so I come out here, and let me go ahead and click on the discussion layout. Again, this just gives me something to start with. I typically, again, do have the webcam view available on this, but it's usually on my fish. I'll go ahead and hide the notes because I don't really use the notes. I go ahead and hide the poll because I don't really use the poll. I do use chat. Okay. Now, I do also, during labs, want them to have access. Okay. So I created. Well, let me start over here. I create a new share, okay, because I like to be able to post images of their lab assignments or write on a whiteboard, so when they need to be back from break and that type of thing. And so that'll be a new share, okay, and we'll go back and I'm going to rename that in a minute. But also here I do want to have my files available. Again, I do a lot of screenshotting and things like that and make files available to my students, and so during labs and lunch and break, that's when I upload my files, and then my students have access to that. And then also, typically, I will use the timer as well. Okay, so I'll bring a timer into this because labs are typically, lunches are typically timed events, and so I'll bring that in here. Get that the way I like it. All right. Now, the next thing that I do is I start naming my layout, specifically renaming my lobby and renaming my discussion. So from here I go to layouts, and then from layouts I'm going to select this option to manage my layouts. And under manage layouts, I'm going to go ahead and highlight lobby, and then I'll go ahead and click on the button to rename that. I'm going to go ahead and rename it. Click on rename, and I just call that pre-class. And then the lecture, since this will be, let's say this is the first day of class, I call that intro. Okay? So I do all my intro stuff in that intro layout, and what that allows me to do is, if a student's watching the recordings, they can skip all the introduction and get right to the meat of the class very quickly because it creates that index point. And then my discussion I rename to lab, lunch, break. And anytime I go on lab, anytime I go on lunch, anytime I go on break, I always switch over to that again. So if someone's looking at the recordings, they can easily just skip over those particular parts of the class. And so that's just a value add for the student. There's certain layouts that at this point I'm not going to use. I'm not going to use this blank layout over here. And if I want to create a new one, I could. So I go ahead and get rid of those. So I click on the X. If you want to delete that, I say yes. I'm not going to use the whiteboard. Okay. So I'll go ahead and delete that. Say yes. Okay. I'm not going to use the activity, so I go ahead and delete that one. And typically, I'm not going to use the footprint either. The reason I delete those is because literally, normally, if I was setting up a class, I wouldn't just have 3 copies of my lecture layout. I would have 8 or 9, because I make a new copy for each subject matter that we go through, and so I want to have the real estate there. So if I know I'm not going to use those other layouts, then I don't use those other layouts. Some other things that I like to do, I'd like to create a new share, okay, and this is going to be share 12, and on that share 12, then I go to pods and I go to manage pods. And I find share 12, and I'm going to go ahead and rename that share. Oops, I want a circle. And I'm going to rename that share desktop. So whenever I share my desktop, I'm going to go ahead and say done. And then I'll go ahead and hide that. When I want to bring up my desktop from here on out, okay, then I can just, go to Pod, Share, and then I just select Desktop. Okay, so I don't keep recreating shares and things like that. Obviously, you might want to load in your introductory slides at this point in time. So under Share My Screens, I'll go ahead and select to, share a document. And under Share Document, I'm going to go to my shared content. And then under Slides, on my shared content, I typically just load up the, the online live standard introduction slides. Now I know that some instructors will preload all their slide decks, so they'll go like they would go to VLANs here, and then they would, load the particular slides. So they would create a new share for that. So go pods, and I can hide the standard share here, and then go to pods and share, and add a new share, and they have a separate share, and then they preload in all their slide decks. I typically don't do that. I just load my slide decks dynamically. Depending on your class and how long it takes for your slide decks to load, it might make sense to go through here and create separate shares and preload all of your slide decks. That's really sort of up to you. One of the things that I do as part of the introduction process, kind of show you this, is I take a screenshot of the classroom environment using a tool called Light Screen. Which I cover in a different video. And after I get done with the introductions, I do go to Share Documents here, browse my computer, and let me go ahead and grab that. And there's my screenshot. And the reason I do that is because then I can use like the drawing bar to, let's go red, let's make it a little bit bigger. And there should be a little red recording button here. There will be when I take my screenshot in class. Show my students the recording button, and make sure they remind them. And then I also show my students the full screen options. So normally, if I have something shared out, I would see it here as well, and I make sure that my students know how to toggle. I show my students where the where the private chat is, and so I just use this screenshot to familiarize them with the environment. Go ahead and hide that. All right, now I'm ready for class. I've got everything set up the way I want. I'm good to go. What I do, is I go ahead and go to Meeting, and I select Record. Boom. So I go ahead and start recording. Now, obviously, that's going to give me some time before class, but because I have that pre-class layout, if a student views the recording, they can skip over all of it, because once class starts, boom, I'm going to go into my layout here for lecture. It's going to be a nice hard index in the recording, and I'm going to be, ready to go. Okay. So to kind of, summarize, what we went through in that particular section, let's go ahead and just kind of try and make a little checklist for us here. So I'm trying to draw some boxes here. So the first thing that we talked about there is, going to, meeting to preference, and then adjusting our cursor. Now, I would consider that to be, optional. You don't necessarily have to do that, but it can benefit you, especially in like an end user class or something like that. From there, the next thing that we looked at was, the meeting to audio setup wizard. Got to make sure your sound's working correctly. So, new computer, new week, new class. Take care of your audio setup wizard. Okay. Next checkbox was the hands up pod. So hands up. And we went into the settings there, and so we turned off sound, and I added the step away. All right. Next thing is get your classroom set up the way you like it. So configure your layouts. There are custom templates. I've got a video on how to set those up. So if you want to save yourself some time in the morning, go ahead and create your own custom template, and your class will be laid out exactly how you like it laid out when you get there. So you get your layouts configured. Again, I use like a pre-class and a lab lunch break, and then I have different lectures, but you know, it's really up to you guys how you want to set up your particular layouts. Okay. And then lastly, let's make this one in red. We'll make it bigger. Not that big. So we want to turn on the recording. So that's sort of the process there. Go in, go to your preferences, adjust your cursor if you feel like that'll be beneficial to you. After that, make sure your audio setup wizard. Oh, forgot one thing. See, that's why we make checklists, right? I gotta make it smaller this time. Somewhere, and this doesn't necessarily need to happen in any particular order, but this is again something that to me is important that you remember to do, is that you enable microphone rights for participants or your students. And again, that's a daily thing that we have to do for those of us that teach multi-day classes. All right. So, you know, just maybe you know, having a checklist and making a checklist for yourself, making sure you go through all of these things every time will be beneficial or useful to you. But hopefully this helps a little bit if you're new to using Adobe Connect in terms of getting your classroom set up and ready to roll in the morning. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk later.